Hey guys, welcome to today's dive into the unknown here on the Cipher Files. We're stepping away from cryptids and into the cold, hard reality of crime, but a crime so baffling, it feels like a cipher waiting to be cracked. We're starting a multi-part journey into one of history's most notorious unsolved mysteries, the Hinterkaifeck murders. It's a case that continues to haunt investigators and enthusiasts alike, a stark reminder that sometimes, the shadows hold on to their secrets fiercely. This story is bizarre, it's tragic, and it's utterly perplexing. If you want me to do more of these deep dives into unsolved cases, like the video and subscribe, it's more useful than you think. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, or what you already know, or think you know, about Hinterkaifeck. Your perspective adds to the conversation. Now, let's dive in and see how it all goes. Picture this scene, it's the late winter of 1922. The air in rural Bavaria, Germany, is crisp, carrying the last chill of March. You're walking down a quiet lane, surrounded by fields, maybe a small patch of woods. You approach a secluded farmstead, Hinterkaifeck. It's not large, just a modest house, a barn, and some outbuildings, sitting pretty much in isolation from the nearest village. It feels peaceful, remote. But in March of 1922, Hinterkaifeck became the stage for a series of events so horrific, so inexplicable, that it etched itself into the annals of crime history, earning a chilling nickname, the Farmhouse murders. And 82 years later, the identity of Germany's unseen killer remains a total mystery. Let's pin down the specifics. The calendar turned from March to April 1922 when the alarm was finally raised. Locals, concerned that the family living at Hinterkaifeck hadn't been seen for several days, went to investigate. What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror. 6 people brutally murdered: Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, Cecilia Gruber, his wife, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, her 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel and 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel, and the family's new maid, Maria Baumgartner. 5 of the victims, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the young Cecilia, along with the maid Maria, were found dead in the barn, having been evidently lured there and killed with a tool, likely a mattock, a sort of pickaxe often used in farming. Little Joseph was found in his bassinet inside the house. All had suffered savage blows to the head. This wasn't a random act of violence that happened and then the perpetrator fled immediately. This case is enduringly famous in Germany, and across Europe, precisely because of the profound layer of bizarreness that sits on top of the sheer brutality. Imagine the scene again, the bodies discovered, the police arriving. But as they investigated, they uncovered unsettling details. Evidence suggested the killer, or killers, had been living on the farm after committing the murders. The cattle had been fed, food had been eaten from the kitchen, the beds showed signs of being slept in. Someone had been there, lingering, in the immediate aftermath of wiping out an entire family and their helper. This detail, perhaps more than any other, elevates Hinterkaifeck from a tragic local crime to a chilling, almost supernatural puzzle. Who would do this? And why would they stay? The case quickly gained notoriety in Germany, captivating and horrifying the public. The isolation of the farm, the total lack of witnesses, the sheer savagery of the killings, and the baffling post-mortem activity on the farm all contributed to an almost mythical status. Newspapers were filled with details, speculation, and the constant, frustrating updates of a police force utterly stumped. Despite extensive investigations, interviews with hundreds of people, and countless theories, no one was ever definitively charged or convicted. The file remains open to this day. And yet, despite its legendary status in Europe, particularly Germany, you might find that Hinterkaifeck isn't nearly as well known in the United States compared to other historical unsolved crimes. Think of Jack the Ripper, or the Zodiac Killer, or even lesser known but still widely discussed American cold cases. Hinterkaifeck doesn't typically appear on that list for the average American crime enthusiast. Why is that? Well, language barriers certainly play a role. A lot of the original documentation and early reporting is in German. Geographic distance also matters. crimes that happen closer to home often resonate more strongly. And perhaps, simply, there are so many compelling unsolved mysteries around the world that some, like Hinterkaifeck, remain more localized legends, failing to cross the Atlantic with the same cultural impact. It's a fascinating example of how the fame and memory of a crime can differ vastly from one continent to another. You could know everything about Lizzie Borden but never have heard the name Hinterkaifeck. So, why does Hinterkaifeck remain uniquely chilling and curious, even if it's not universally famous? It's the confluence of factors that defy easy explanation. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong, nothing of value was taken. It wasn't a simple revenge killing, the motives remain utterly obscure, despite decades of digging into the Gruber family's complicated history and relationships. The way the victims were killed, lured out one by one into the barn in the fading light, suggests a degree of planning and control, yet the killer then lingered on the property as if they had nowhere else to go, or perhaps, felt some twisted right to be there. The strange preceding events, footprints in the snow leading to the farm but none leading away, objects moved, sounds in the attic, paint a picture of someone potentially already hiding, already present, an unseen shadow lurking before the attack. It wasn't just a sudden outburst of violence, it had this terrifying prelude. And the lack of resolution is the bitter icing on this dark cake. So many theories have been proposed over the years: disgruntled neighbors, former lovers, escaped prisoners, even a theory involving the son thought to have died in the war returning incognito. But every lead went cold, every suspect was ultimately released or cleared due to lack of evidence. The tools used were common farm implements. The killer left no identifiable trace beyond the horrifying scene itself and the bizarre lingering. It feels like a ghost committed the crime, leaving no physical footprint, no clear motive, just devastation and unanswered questions. That's what makes Hinterkaifeck more than just another unsolved murder case. It's a puzzle box crafted from tragedy, and 82 years later, no one has found the key. It stands as a testament to the fact that sometimes, the most disturbing horrors are those we can't explain, committed by an enemy we never see coming. This is where our journey into the shadows of Hinterkaifeck begins. Okay, so you're picturing this small, rural village in Bavaria, Germany, back in the early 1920s. A place where everyone knows everyone, where life moves at the pace of the seasons. And just outside this village, on a small rise, you find the Hinterkaifeck farm. It's a quiet, unassuming place. Isolated, really. You're looking at a farmhouse, a barn, stables, all the typical buildings of a working farm. But there's an air about it now, isn't there? Knowing what happened here. It sits there, silent, holding its secrets close. This farm is home to the Gruber family. At the head is Andreas Gruber, the patriarch. He's in his 60s, known locally as a stern, perhaps difficult, man. Not the easiest to get along with. His wife is Cecilia, also in her 60s. Then there's their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, who lives with them along with her 2 young children. The eldest is Cecilia Gabriel, named after her grandmother, just 7 years old. And the youngest, little Joseph Gabriel, a boy just 2 years old. 5 members of the family, all living under this roof. And then there's Maria Baumgartner. She's the maid, hired just days before the tragedy. The previous maid had left 6 months earlier, apparently spooked by strange noises in the house. That's where things start to get odd. You see, the quiet life at Hinterkaifeck wasn't always just quiet. In the months leading up to the murders, strange things began to happen. You can imagine Andreas Gruber, a practical man, trying to make sense of them. First, there were footprints. Not just any footprints, but footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the woods to the farmhouse, but none leading away. As if someone had arrived and then, vanished into the house. Who would do that? And why? Andreas searched the property, the village, but found nothing, no one. Then came other incidents. Keys that disappeared and then reappeared in strange places. Objects moving within the house without explanation. These aren't just minor annoyances, they're unsettling. You'd start to feel watched, wouldn't you? A creeping sense of unease settling over the quiet farm. Andreas even told neighbors he'd heard footsteps in the attic directly above his bedroom, but when he went up to check, he found nothing. He even purchased a watchdog, but the dog vanished shortly before the murders. He considered calling the police but reportedly decided against it, perhaps not wanting to seem paranoid or foolish, or maybe not truly believing anything was seriously wrong. It's a decision you can't help but dwell on. The events leading up to the murders culminated on March 31, 1922. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived that very day. Imagine her first day on the job, stepping into this household with its undercurrent of unexplained events. The family likely spent the day much like any other, working on the farm. Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, the children, and Maria. 6 people going about their routine lives, unaware of the horror that was about to descend. The next few days passed silently at Hinterkaifeck. Too silently. Neighbors noticed the smoke from the chimney had stopped, the animals weren't being tended to. The children didn't show up for school. This wasn't normal for the Gruber family. By April 4, concern turned to alarm. A few neighbors, including Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local farmer who had a past connection to the family, decided to go to the farm to check on them. What they found there is difficult to comprehend. The farmhouse door was locked from the inside. No response to their calls. They managed to get into the barn. And that's where they made the horrific discovery. In the barn, they found 4 bodies, Andreas and Kazilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her daughter, 7-year-old Kazilia Gabriel. All brutally murdered, their bodies stacked on top of each other, hidden under hay and a blanket. The scene is almost unbelievable, killed right there, in the place where they worked. Alarmed, the neighbors then searched the house. Inside, they found the bodies of 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel in his cradle in his mother's bedroom, and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, in her bedchamber. 6 people, all dead. The quiet farm had become a scene of unimaginable horror. The initial investigation began immediately, but from the start, it was riddled with puzzling details. The victims were killed with a tool, likely a mattock or a similar farm implement, found nearby. The nature of the wounds was horrific, inflicted with extreme violence. Yet, the house itself showed no signs of forced entry. The door was locked from the inside. It was as if the killer was already inside the house, or had been let in. More strangely, while the family and maid were murdered, the farm showed signs of life continuing. The livestock had been fed, the cows milked. Food had been eaten in the kitchen. Someone had stayed at the farm after the murders, for several days. You have to ask yourself, who kills 6 people and then sticks around to do chores and eat dinner? It makes no sense. Possessions of value, like money found in the house, were not taken. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It feels personal, or perhaps something else entirely. The timelines are confusing too. The murders likely happened on the night of March 31, judging by when the family was last seen alive. But the bodies weren't discovered until April 4, and during that time, someone was clearly living on the farm. The initial police work, by modern standards, was lacking. The scene wasn't properly secured or documented. Evidence was likely contaminated or lost. Many people from the village were allowed to walk through the house, trampling potential clues. The local police were overwhelmed by the sheer brutality and mystery of the crime. They brought in investigators from Munich, but precious time had already passed. The discovery, the state of the bodies, the untouched money, the continued activity on the farm, the locked doors, the strange occurrences beforehand, it all adds up to a mystery that refuses to be solved. You're left with a scene that is both horrifying and utterly baffling. Who did this, and why did they stay? It's a question that hangs heavy in the air, even 100 years later. Okay, so after that horrifying discovery, where the neighbors finally broke into the farm and found the bodies, the focus immediately shifts to the scene itself. What secrets does Hinterkaifeck hold? What can the physical space tell us about the monstrous act that took place there? Welcome back to the Cipher Files. In this part, we step cautiously into the silent house and farm, examining the verifiable evidence left behind. You see, when investigators arrived, they were faced with a scene that was both chillingly obvious and deeply perplexing. It wasn't just a case of identifying the victims, it was about decoding the story the farm itself was trying to tell. Our data sources for piecing this together come primarily from the original police reports filed by the investigators on the scene, detailed witness statements taken from the neighbors who made the discovery and those who had interacted with the family shortly before, and the initial forensic observations, though, as you can imagine, the term forensic in 1922 is vastly different from what we understand today. We're dealing with basic visual inspection, physical measurements, and rudimentary analysis, not DNA or advanced toxicology. Let's start with the most immediate, undeniable piece of evidence, the murder weapon. Found leaning against a fence near the stable where 4 of the bodies lay, was a mattock. Not a sophisticated weapon, not a weapon brought from elsewhere, but a tool likely found right there on the farm. This heavy farming implement, used for digging and grubbing, was stained with blood. It's a brutal, blunt instrument, and the nature of the victim's injuries, severe head trauma, aligns tragically with blows from such a tool. The fact that the killer used a farm tool implies either spontaneity or a chilling familiarity with the farm's resources. It wasn't a planned weapon carried onto the property, it was something readily available, turned from a tool of labor into an instrument of death. Now, consider the arrangement of the bodies. This is one of the most disturbing and telling pieces of evidence. For bodies, Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, Kazilia Gruber, his wife, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's daughter, Kazilia, were found in the stable, stacked almost on top of each other, just inside the door. It appears they were lured or forced into the stable one by one and killed there. Imagine being forced into a dark stable, perhaps hearing the terrifying sounds as the person in front of you meets their end. The sheer physical arrangement suggests a methodical approach, a killer controlling the situation completely. The other 2 victims, the maid Maria Baumgartner and little Joseph Gabriel, Victoria's 2-year-old son, were found inside the house. Maria in her bed, Joseph in his cradle in his mother's room. This separation is crucial. It suggests the killings happened in stages, or that different victims were targeted in different locations or at different times. The stable murders likely happened first, given their position near the entrance to the farm complex from the outside world, perhaps as people arrived home that evening. Then, the killer moved inside. And this leads us to the evidence that the killer, or killers, stayed at the farm after committing these horrific acts. This isn't speculation, it's based on multiple observations documented in the reports and witness statements. Food had been eaten from the kitchen. Freshly prepared food was found, indicating meals had been consumed after the murders. The beds, including some of the victims' beds, appeared to have been slept in. The fire in the hearth had been lit. The farm animals, cows, chickens, had been fed and cared for. The killer wasn't just a fleeting visitor, they were an occupant for potentially several days after the murders. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail, the idea of someone living alongside the bodies, going about daily chores in the house of the dead family. What does this tell us about the killer's mindset? It speaks to a level of cold detachment, a bizarre sense of business as usual, that is almost incomprehensible. Crucially, let's look at what was not found. There was no sign of forced entry. Doors and windows were found locked from the inside or showed no signs of being broken open. This suggests the killer was either let in or had a key, or perhaps was already on the property, hiding, when the family returned. Coupled with the lack of forced entry, there was also no clear motive for robbery. While some small amount of money might have been taken, reports vary and are often conflicting on exact amounts, significant valuables were left untouched. The farm wasn't ransacked. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This eliminates one of the most common motives for such a violent crime and immediately points investigators towards possibilities like revenge, a personal vendetta, or something far more psychologically complex. Now, let's consider the limitations. This is 1922. Forensic science as we know it barely existed. Fingerprinting was in its infancy and likely not applied systematically or effectively at the scene. There was no understanding of DNA, trace evidence like fibers or hairs was overlooked, and bloodstain pattern analysis was non-existent. The primary investigative tools were observation, witness interviews, and logical deduction based on common motives. The weaknesses in the evidence collection are glaring from a modern perspective. The scene was likely contaminated by the initial group of neighbors who entered. Evidence wasn't meticulously catalogued, photographed from multiple angles, or properly preserved using sterile techniques. The farm itself was located in a rural area, and specialized investigative resources were limited. Crucially, the mattock, the likely murder weapon, was simply picked up and examined, its potential trace evidence compromised. Think about the potential for fingerprints, fibers from the killer's clothing, or other biological material that would be collected today. All likely lost. There were also inconsistencies noted even at the time. Reports on exactly what was missing, if anything, varied. Initial witness statements from people who saw strange things around the farm in the days prior weren't immediately given the weight they perhaps should have been. The focus quickly became identifying a perpetrator, sometimes leading investigators down paths based on assumptions rather than purely on the fragile evidence collected. So, you have this tableau: bodies in the stable, bodies inside, a farm tool as the weapon, undeniable proof someone lived in the house of the dead for days, no sign of break-in, and no clear robbery motive. All viewed through the limited lens of early 20th century investigation. The evidence is powerful in what it shows happened but frustratingly weak in identifying who did it and why, largely due to the era's constraints on collection and analysis. It's a silent crime scene, yes, but the evidence it does contain whispers terrifying possibilities, while the gaps in that evidence scream about the challenges faced by those trying to decode its secrets. Alright, we've pieced together the timeline, examined the chilling scene at Hinterkaifeck, and looked at the initial, often fumbling, investigation. Now, you're probably asking, who did this? With the crime scene yielding few definitive clues and the victims unable to speak, the focus inevitably shifted to hypotheses, the potential explanations for such an unfathomable act. This is where we delve into the murky waters of speculation, trying to fit potential motives to the brutal reality of what happened on that isolated farm. The police, and later independent investigators and enthusiasts, have proposed numerous theories over the years. Each one attempts to wrap a narrative around the sparse, unsettling facts. Let's unpack the most prominent ones, weighing the arguments for and against each, always holding them up against the peculiar evidence we've found. One of the most common initial thoughts for a crime involving death on a farm is robbery. It makes a certain kind of sense, doesn't it? Isolated location, cash potentially kept on hand. But how well does it fit Hinterkaifeck? Arguments for a robbery gone wrong center on the idea that someone came to steal and was surprised, or perhaps intended to eliminate witnesses from the start. Andreas Gruber was known to have some money, although reports vary on the exact amount. However, the evidence strongly argues against simple robbery. For starters, significant amounts of money and valuables were not taken from the house. A few items might have been disturbed, but nothing indicates a thorough ransacking for loot. More damningly, the killer or killers stayed on the farm for several days after the murders. They ate food, tended to the livestock, and even made minor repairs. This behavior is completely inconsistent with a typical burglar who wants to grab what they can and disappear as quickly as possible. Why risk being discovered by lingering? This crucial point makes a pure, robbery gone wrong, scenario highly improbable. Another theory often floated involves a jilted lover or someone seeking revenge related to the family's complicated personal lives. We know Andreas Gruber had a strained relationship with his daughter Victoria, and there were rumors and later confirmation of an incestuous relationship, resulting in Joseph. Victoria herself had a son, Joseph, whose paternity was disputed, and her husband, Karl Gabriel, was reported killed in the war, though his body was never confirmed. Add to this Andreas's reputation for being difficult and potentially abusive. Could a former suitor of Victoria, a relative angered by the family dynamics, or someone with a personal grievance against Andreas have sought violent retribution? Arguments for this theory often highlight the potential for intense personal motive, passion, betrayal, or deep-seated resentment, which could explain the brutality of the killings. The intimate nature of the crime, using farm tools found on site, potentially knowing the layout, could suggest someone familiar with the family or the farm. However, finding concrete evidence linking a specific individual with a strong enough motive to all 6 victims is the major hurdle. While personal animosity might explain targeting Andreas or Victoria, it doesn't easily account for the brutal murder of the children and the maid. Speaking of family dynamics, the dark secret of incest between Andreas and Victoria inevitably gives rise to the family conflict hypothesis. Could one member of the family have been responsible for killing the others? This is a deeply disturbing thought. Arguments for this might involve one party snapping under the strain, or a twisted plan for some unknown gain. The familiarity with the farm and victims is inherent here. However, the evidence again pushes back strongly. Who could have done it? Andreas was killed first in the barn, along with Victoria, Silly, and Joseph. This makes it virtually impossible for any of them to be the killer. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, was new and unlikely to turn on the entire family so violently. This theory, while touching upon the terrible secrets of the household, doesn't logically explain who within the family could have committed the crime given the circumstances of their deaths. What about a transient killer or a wanderer passing through the area? The isolation of Hinterkaifeck could make it seem like an easy target for someone with no ties to the community. Arguments for this involve the idea of a random, opportunistic act of violence. Perhaps someone was looking for shelter or food and was discovered, leading to panic and murder. However, like the robbery theory, the killer's actions after the murders contradict this. Staying for days, performing chores, giving the appearance of normal life continuing, this level of deliberate, sustained presence points away from a random transient and towards someone with a different agenda or psychology. It suggests a degree of comfort or calculation, not fear and immediate flight. Could it have been a neighbor dispute escalated to horrific levels? Rural communities can sometimes harbor simmering feuds. Arguments for this hypothesis point to the idea that a local person would know the farm, the family's routines, and the best time to strike. Someone living nearby might have had a grievance over land, property lines, or personal issues. The neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was involved in finding the bodies and had a complex relationship with Victoria and Joseph, was a frequent suspect. His behavior, including showing up at the farm before others, and his knowledge of the layout, fueled suspicion. Arguments against a neighbor often involve the lack of a clear, powerful motive that would justify killing everyone on the farm. While disputes happened, mass murder of this scale was unheard of. Furthermore, while Schlittenbauer was investigated, no definitive link or evidence placing him at the scene as the killer ever materialized. The strange post-murder activities also feel less like a typical neighborly revenge plot and more like something else entirely. Analyzing the potential causes from a broader perspective, human factors, specifically motive and psychology, are at the heart of trying to understand why this happened. Was it greed, revenge, madness, a combination? The specific nature of the crime suggests extreme rage and possibly a calculated plan to eliminate witnesses. The technical limitations of the time played a huge role in the investigation's failure. Without modern forensic science, DNA analysis, detailed fingerprinting, blood splatter analysis, crucial clues were likely missed or misinterpreted. The crime scene was also disturbed early on. Social and political factors, like the unrest and distrust following World War I in rural Bavaria, might have contributed to a general climate of fear and suspicion, perhaps making neighbors hesitant to come forward or authorities less efficient due to limited resources and communication. But these factors are more about why the crime wasn't solved than the direct mechanism of the murders themselves, which seems rooted in human action and motive, however obscure. Ultimately, each theory, when held against the unique, disturbing evidence of Hinterkaifeck, the victims lured to the barn, the killer living amongst the dead, the lack of clear motive or theft, seems to have significant holes. The faceless killer remains just that, hiding in the gaps between these unproven hypotheses and the strange, silent testimony of the farm itself. The Hinterkaifeck case, for all its unsettling details and chilling atmosphere, remains, to this day, officially unsolved. It is a riddle wrapped in a rural tragedy, a puzzle box that the years have failed to open. You look at the evidence, you hear the theories, and you wonder how something so brutal, involving an entire family and their maid, could simply vanish into the ether without a culprit ever being definitively named or brought to justice. So, why hasn't this case been solved? It's a question that haunts anyone who delves into the story, and the reasons are layered, compounding the tragedy itself. Firstly, there was a distinct lack of clear, unambiguous evidence left behind. The scene, though horrific, offered few tangible clues pointing directly to an individual. There were tools suspected as weapons, yes, but they were common farm implements, offering no unique forensic signature in an era without sophisticated ballistics or DNA analysis. The killer or killers were unnervingly meticulous in certain ways, cutting the engine, the antenna, possibly blocking escape routes, suggesting a degree of planning, but left surprisingly little trace of themselves. No fingerprints, or none found or useful, no distinct footprints leading away, no dropped items tying them to the scene. The snow that fell shortly after the murders might have covered tracks, or perhaps the killer was simply careful. Then you have the conflicting testimony. Witness accounts leading up to the discovery were inconsistent and fragmented. Some reported seeing strange men, others didn't. The time frame of the murders is still debated because neighbors reported seeing signs of life on the farm after the generally accepted time of death. People saw smoke from the chimney, heard the dog barking, saw light in the windows. Were they mistaken? Were they seeing the killers still on the property? These discrepancies created confusion from the outset, muddying the waters for investigators. This leads directly to the significant investigative errors in the immediate aftermath. The initial response was slow and perhaps not fully appreciating the gravity of the situation immediately. Crucially, the crime scene was not preserved in the way we understand it today. Neighbors, curious onlookers, and even villagers trod through the farm before police secured it properly, potentially destroying or contaminating valuable evidence. Bodies were moved relatively quickly for examination, further disrupting the scene. The initial focus was heavily on specific suspects, like the Gruber family's former maid, who had left citing the farm was haunted, or the previous maid's lover, leading to tunnel vision that might have ignored other possibilities. This era lacked standardized crime scene procedures, and Hinterkaifeck suffered because of it. Insufficient forensic technology at the time was another major hurdle. Imagine trying to solve this case today. You'd have DNA analysis from saliva on cigarette butts found in the barn, from hair follicles, from skin cells possibly transferred during a struggle. You'd have advanced fingerprinting techniques, digital forensics if any electronic devices were present, though not relevant here, detailed soil analysis from footprints. None of this existed in 1922. The investigators relied on observation, interviews, and basic physical evidence, none of which proved sufficient to crack the case. Finally, you consider the killer's meticulous actions within the crime scene itself. The fact that someone lived on the farm for several days after committing the murders, feeding the animals, eating food, suggests an unnerving level of cold calculation and familiarity with the location. This wasn't a panicked, spur-of-the-moment act. This was someone who knew the farm, knew the routine, waiting for the family to be isolated or gathered, and was comfortable remaining there, almost as if taunting discovery or simply finishing what they started, like feeding the animals, which continued. This level of composure and knowledge made the killer extremely difficult to trace. Given these factors, the poor evidence, the conflicting reports, the initial investigative failings, the lack of technology, and the killer's strange behavior, is it possible this case could ever be solved in the future? Frankly, the likelihood is extremely low. All the key witnesses are long dead. The physical evidence, what little there was, is gone or has been handled countless times over the decades. There are no DNA samples to test against a modern database. Unless a long-lost confession surfaces, and remains credible after 100 years, or some completely unknown diary or letter comes to light, the official record will almost certainly remain unsolved. The case files have been reviewed multiple times over the years, most recently by police recruits as training exercises, but no new leads have emerged from the old evidence. The consequences and impacts of this unsolved crime echo through time and place. Most tragically, it had a devastating effect on the individuals and families involved. For the victims, it was a terrifying, brutal end, seemingly without clear motive or warning. For the surviving relatives, it meant losing loved ones in the most horrific way imaginable, compounded by the constant, gnawing uncertainty of never knowing who did it or why. The community of Gruber was plunged into fear and suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other warily, wondering if the killer was among them, if they had unknowingly spoken to them, or worse, if they were the next target. Accusations flew, relationships strained, and a pervasive sense of unease settled over the seemingly peaceful Bavarian countryside. The impact on the local community was profound in a tangible sense too. The Hinterkaifeck farm itself, the site of such horror, was eventually torn down in 1925. People didn't want to live there, they didn't even want it to stand as a reminder of the tragedy. Stones from the farm were reportedly removed and used elsewhere, perhaps in a macabre attempt to scatter the memory, but the site remains empty land today, a scar on the landscape. The name Hinterkaifeck became synonymous with unspeakable crime in the region. Potential broader lessons learned from this mystery relate perhaps less to solving this specific case now, and more to understanding the nature of crime itself. It underscores the critical importance of rapid, careful crime scene preservation. It highlights how a lack of clear motive can make an investigation incredibly difficult. When you don't understand the why, finding the who becomes exponentially harder. It reminds us that some crimes, even those seemingly straightforward in their brutality, can disappear into baffling complexity. And it serves as a chilling example of how someone capable of such horror could seemingly vanish without a trace, living among people, perhaps, before and after the event. It forces us to confront the unnerving idea of seemingly motiveless killings and the darkness that can reside unseen. So, the Hinterkaifeck case remains an enduring mystery, a historical whodunit locked away behind a century of silence. It challenges our assumptions about crime, motive, and the ability of justice to always prevail. It's a story that refuses to be neatly filed away, a shadow that lingers over a quiet corner of Germany. Now, as we close the book on this particular file, the Hinterkaifeck case, it leaves us with so much to ponder. It's a stark reminder of vulnerability, of how the most secure-seeming places can become scenes of unimaginable horror. The consequences ripple out from the victims to the community, the physical landscape, and even, in a sense, to us, the people decades later trying to decipher the truth. It teaches us about the limitations of investigation, especially in earlier times, and the critical role of those first few hours and days. And perhaps, it teaches us that some mysteries are destined to remain just that, mysteries, haunting the edges of history. We've explored the timeline, the bizarre clues, the potential suspects, and the reasons it's unsolved. What stands out for you? What piece of the puzzle feels most significant or most baffling? Knowing what you know now, who do you think could have committed this terrible act, or what alternative explanations might there be? Your insights and theories are what keep these historical riddles alive and debated. If this deep dive into a historical mystery was intriguing for you, show your support. Liking the video helps so much more than you think, it tells me you want more content like this. Sharing it with friends who love true crime or history helps spread the word about the Cipher Files. And, of course, subscribing ensures you won't miss our next exploration into the unknown. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, your perspectives add so much to the conversation.